Okay, so welcome to the seventh and final lecture of competition policy. So today I would like to talk a little bit about two-sided markets. In particular, I would like to use this topic as a way of illustrating some of the themes that we've seen in the lectures so far. So for what I'll do is, first give a little bit of an introduction. So there are two-sided markets for those who haven't seen those yet. And actually, the main part of this lecture, I'd like to talk about a particular paper, a working paper that I've been doing, some work that I've been doing myself with two colleagues in Groningen, in which actually some of the points that we've discussed in the first 6 lectures of this course will come back to us. So I will make that discussion, and in the end, after having concluded that paper, I'll give a wrap up of what we have done actually in the entire course, and what's important for the exam. So what I did on this slide is actually collect a couple of headlines, basically from, I guess, more or less the last 2 months. So if you have a look at those, what you see is, the common theme here is there's actually has been quite a lot of action on the competition authority front towards digital platforms, we might call them, so like Amazon or Google or Alibaba. They would be those firms which get called big tech, right? The big tech firms. So big tech firms and their interaction with competition policy, competition authorities has been all over the news. Well, for a couple of years already, I guess, but even more than before for the last 6 months or so. So we saw, of course, last lecture week some presentations that you gave on Google Android. So in particular, so we actually had already over the past years the 3 different Google cases so far that have been carried out by the European Commission. And well, it's not only the European Commission lately which have been worried about the market power of the Googles, the Apples, and the Amazons of this world, but also competition authorities in other parts of the world. So China, you see here getting tougher on big tech, in particular Alibaba, the Chinese big tech firm, the DOJ in the Justice Department in the US suing Google for violating antitrust laws. So it might be sort of related to those Google cases in the EU. EU attacking Amazon, or at least not exploring Amazon for potential breach of antitrust rules in its sales on its retail platform. Apple, so Apple Pay in particular, Facebook becoming under scrutiny, and indeed the FTC in the US taking action here with the ultimate goal allegedly to break up Facebook, which would be a novelty. So in the sense of not having occurred that much since, I guess, 1985 or 1986, when AT&T was broken up into under as an antitrust measure. So in particular, this case is about undoing some of the mergers that have been allowed in the earlier years of essentially now of the previous decade. So, for instance, the Facebook WhatsApp merger, the Facebook Instagram mergers, they were cleared in the around 2014. But now actually authorities have second thoughts about whether this was a good idea, and there's talk about breaking up Facebook in different parts. So these are just a couple of examples, and there are more, of course. So if you read the newspapers, you see headlines like these actually every week. So the common theme of these big tech firms is that they are platforms. So platforms are essentially two-sided markets. So platform firms might be media firms or gaming platforms like PlayStation or Xbox, ride-sharing platforms like Uber or Lyft, shopping platforms, so Amazon is actually one of those. So why are they platforms, or why are they two-sided? Well, they cater to two sides. These two sides might be, well, on one side, typically consumers of the services that these platforms um, deliver to the end users. But on the other side, these platforms are actually intermediaries, and intermediaries towards the other side as well, who might be advertisers who want to advertise to consumers through the media, game developers who want to sell their games through the gaming platforms to the consumers, so drivers who compete to sell their ride-sharing services to consumers indeed, and sellers who want to reach buyers on some of these auction websites. And the main uh, definitional part of these platforms is, well, that either both of these sites basically typically care about how many consumers or how many players there are on the other side. So consumers like a platform better when it attracts, so for instance, a gaming platform is going to be more attractive to consumers if there are more game developers that are actually developing games for that platform. A ride-sharing platform is more interesting for consumers when there is more drivers who are attached to that, but also vice versa. Advertisers, game developers, drivers, they all benefit from linking up with a platform that has more consumers on it. So there are essentially these cross-platform externalities, which are the defining characteristics of these two-sided markets, or these platforms. So I'll use these two terms essentially um, uh, to denote the same thing: platforms or two-sided markets. So the issues of competition among digital platforms, or competition on digital platforms, and the actions of digital platforms themselves, as I said, come to the limelight, in particular in the past few years, but has been under well, theoretic and also regulatory actually scrutiny for the past, well, almost 2 decades. Actually, it started with the two-sided markets literature, which really took off in the early 2000s. And actually, that was triggered in large part also by competition or policy attention, particularly at that point towards the payment markets, and market for credit card payments, for instance. So that has been an active and exciting research area, and well, that's the case now more than ever. So actually within the industrial organization or the industrial economics literature, so platform economics, platform competition is a very hot area right at the moment. So if you're considering doing your thesis in this area, well, this might be a nice way to start, as certainly this will also, well, not only be interesting theoretically, but also will be very interesting on the job market as well, because you can be sure that with all the recent policy attention, there's going to be a lot of hiring in these sectors as well. So indeed, this economic literature has also been influential in policy making. So actually, last year and the year before that, actually, there have been a number of very influential reports by economists to policymakers, in particular to antitrust policymakers in different jurisdictions. So some of the well-known ones are the Furman report in the UK, the Stickler Center report in the US, and the report by Jacques Remer and co-authors to the European Commission, describing the potential competition issues relating to big tech in particular. And these issues, these reports have been, again, in their turn, been influential in shaping the policy responses. So that there has been a big investigative committee in the Congress in the the House of Representatives report earlier in 2020. And recently, actually, we saw the European Commission taking actions to, or at least announcing the writing of new acts, in particular the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. And those acts are actually look towards very much stricter regulation of these sectors in order to deal with these concerns over competition in the big tech area. So as I mentioned, there's also a lot of new theoretical work that has been coming out in the last years or so, and will be coming out in the coming years as well. And we can be sure of that. So what I would like to do today is actually discuss some recent work on platform competition, which is written in a paper that I did together with two colleagues of mine at the University of Groningen, Marco Haan and Nanette Stoffers. So this is still a working paper actually, but it's available on Blackboard. So I obviously chose this paper because I did it myself, so I'm familiar with it, of course. But also because it sort of highlights some of the issues that we've been speaking about during the course. So the idea of this paper that I'm going to discuss today is mainly basically to illustrate some of the issues again that we did so far. Not so much. So I'm not going to ask you on the details of this particular paper actually on the exam. So this is more a way of illustration of what we did, by way of example of stuff that we did before, and to give you an idea of what research in this area, or theoretical research in this area currently, might actually mean for those who want to contemplate doing something like that, for instance, as part of their thesis. So the motivation for this particular paper is basically captured in the following example, the Google and Amazon example. So historically, of course, Google and Amazon were quite distinct, very diverse companies. So if you say Google, and the first thing that I think of would be search and perhaps also email and advertising. And Amazon, of course, it arose as an online bookshop actually, and later on expanded into other services. So it was mostly a retail platform basically for online buying. So a platform for its own goods, and a little bit later also for other shops to sell their goods to consumers. And if you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would not have really viewed those two as direct competitors. Well, that's a bit different now. So this is actually Google it or Alexa. That's actually a headline from a news story 2 years ago, I think, which actually documents the fact that Google and Amazon are now very strong competitors. So perhaps I think this particular article called Amazon the most important competitor of Google so far actually. So apparently Amazon is having much larger, rapidly growing market share in the market for targeted ads. So targeted ads or advertising in general is of course the pillar of Google's income, but Amazon is getting rapidly bigger and bigger in this market as well. So why is that? Well, because they are collecting so much detailed data on their users that they can sell this data or act as an advertising intermediary, an advertising broker for other companies who want to target specific sorts of consumers. So if you want to target your ads towards perhaps those who recently had a baby, families who recently had a baby, you of course Amazon would actually have some information on which families those would be, because those would be particularly the families that would have bought baby stuff on Amazon, right? So they can use that information actually to help you target your ad. So of course, not only targeted ads is an area in which these two companies are big competitors, but many new areas like the Home Assistant, Google Assistant versus the Alexa system, and of course the other big tech players. But Apple has its own Home Assistant, the Siri assistant, of course. So this is not restricted just to Google and Amazon. Also in the area of smart homes, you have Google Home Services versus the Amazon Echo product line, so which, for instance, involves products for home security. Cloud computation is a relatively new area in which these firms are some of the leading firms today and competing vigorously to attract market share. Online gaming is one in which I want to get bigger. So currently they're, I think, not that big, but they are actually expanding in that area as well. And there are many more actually areas, of course, in which actually both these firms are active and are going to you know set to become more active competitors. So the question that we ask in this particular research is, should we expect these firms and firms in this two-sided market platform area to become more similar over time? And what we want to explore in this paper is, well, what is the optimal competitive strategy that such a two-sided platform should follow, and how does that depend on different characteristics? So particularly what we're going to look at in this paper is the issue of advertising in particular, and the issue and how it interconnects, how it interacts with what's called multi-homing or single homing. So this picture actually tries to elucidate that. So here you see Google and Amazon, the two platforms, and they are, as I mentioned, two-sided markets. So they're serving consumers who buy their services, the downstream market, if you wish, but they're also serving the retail sector, who actually are buying advertising slots, or they're buying referrals for the goods that they want to sell. They're buying or using the data to make better targeted ads, for instance, towards these consumers. So these retail agencies or the advertising agencies, they care in particular how many consumers are linking up to the platform that they do business with. So they will be more willing to pay Google for its services if Google has more consumers, and the same for Amazon. Vice versa, it might also be the case that there is some externality there. Of course, consumers might be averse actually to advertising, so there might be negative externality across the platform. So if consumers dislike advertising, so we're not actually going to look at that. So we're going to focus on the fact that retailers actually like seeing those consumers on the platform. Now, these consumers are linking up to different platforms. Well, some consumers actually might only consume from one of these platforms, or mainly consume from one of these platforms, and not so much from the other. So the green consumers downstairs there, there's a consumers only buying from Google or only buying services from Amazon. And for these consumers are called single homing, so they just home in on one of these platforms. But some other consumers might actually buy or be active on both types of platforms. So you might, for instance, buy or use search from Google, but use cloud computing from Amazon, and then you will be multi-homing. So that's the red types of consumers would be those who are multi-homing on two or more platforms. So the idea is that whether a consumer is multi-homing or single-homing, so whether it frequents mostly just a single platform or whether this consumer frequents many platforms, is going to be important for platform profits. Why is that? Well, in particular, because if you're single homing, so if I'm only basically going on major parts of the internet through just one of these platforms, then if an advertiser wants to reach me, it would have to go through this particular one platform. So if I'm only on Google, then if an advertiser wants to reach me, it will have to depend on Google to serve me this ad or to get my data for them to target me better. So essentially what this does is make this platform, Google in this case, into a bottleneck. So a bottleneck is a gatekeeper, sometimes known as a gatekeeper. So they are the gatekeeper in the sense that this advertiser has to go through Google, in this case, through this particular platform, which actually gives Google, this platform, a monopoly over access to this particular consumer. So consumers that can only be reached by one platform, for those consumers, this particular platform has the monopoly on access rights for advertisers. And that means it can charge these advertisers much more to put through advertisements to these particular consumers than for those consumers who are multi-homing. Because if they are multi-homing, well, then there's going to be competition on providing this data or this access between those two platforms. So the red consumers on the previous diagram here, they can be reached by these advertisers either through Google or Amazon, and there might be competition between Google and Amazon in providing the data of these consumers to these advertisers, and that's going to eat into the profits on the advertising sides of these platforms. So in a nutshell, these retailers are willing to pay more, or will have to pay more to the platforms for access to consumers when these consumers are single homing, but these monopoly rents will be eaten away by competition among the platforms for those consumers who are multi-homing. So on the advertising side, the advertising revenues are going to depend on this multi versus single homing on the consumer side. So indeed, the consumers who are multi-homing, the platforms are competing in giving this access. So this particular example will be duopoly. So if this, for instance, is a Bertrand duopoly, so all these monopoly rents are going to be dissipated away by competition, and what you might actually the maximum that you might be able to ask in this competition, this Bertrand competition, will be, well, the second best value, essentially the value that you can still offer in addition as for the second advertising impression that you may be able to offer to these firms. So if that still has any value to offer two advertisements to a single consumer rather than just one, well, then the additional rent you can actually extract, but not the monopoly rents. So the idea then of this paper is that the size of these single homing rents and the size of these monopoly rents on the advertising side, so how much rents can I extract in addition if I'm a monopoly gatekeeper from these advertisers, so as advertising income, that's going to impact competitive strategy that these firms are going to follow in the market for consumers. So if these monopoly rents that you can charge as a platform to these advertisers are not so important, so it's they are not willing to pay that much for this particular right of first access essentially to these consumers, that's not so big. Then what you would like to do is you would like to choose strategies as a platform that are going to maximize the profit that you can make from selling to consumers. So how would you do that? Well, you would like to soften competition with your rivals. So you would rather be, monopolists into very diverse areas, and you follow, well, let's call it a live and let live strategy, so that you can both basically be, monopolists on different goods for each consumer, and you don't really rely that much on the advertising monopoly benefits. But on the other hand, if these single homing rents are really large, so if it's going to matter to you whether a consumer that you're serving is also served by your rival platform, because if it's not, if they are single home, you can get much higher profits from advertising than if these consumers are multi-homing. Well, then you would actually rather make sure that all these consumers that you do reach you and only you, and not in particular not your rival. So how can you make sure that that's going to happen? Well, by making sure that your platform is actually engaging in very furious competition, head-on competition with your rival. That might limit the revenues that you may get from consumers directly, but also make sure that those consumers who go to you, who shop at your place, basically at your platform, will not also be served by your rival. So they will be single home in particular on your platform, and that will mean that you can charge these large single homing rents from these advertisers. So what we do in this paper is we look at this distinction between markets in which these single homing rents are fairly small versus markets in which these single homing monopoly rents that can be extracted from advertisers are very large, and we look at those in various competitive decisions that these firms and these platform firms will be making. So the first one to kick off, basically, the analysis is on product positioning. So would we like to be active in independent market areas, which consumers have independent demands for, or would we rather position ourselves as close substitutes? So various platforms producing goods, producing services that consumers essentially only need one of, either yours or your rivals. And then we'll have a look at mergers. So we look at the merger waves, essentially, so which two different mergers might take place shortly after another. And we actually will find that when these single homing rents are fairly small, then it's going to be attractive for a company to merge with another company which is producing a substitute, so a closely related good. Whereas when these monopoly rents are large on the advertising side, then on the consumption side, you would like to merge with platforms which provide products which are essentially unrelated to your original product. And finally, we're going to look at in the paper, and at least we'll be looking at compatibility of products. If you have various different goods which can either be standardized so that they can work together, or they might be incompatible, so that one firm's goods only work well with the same firm's, apps, for instance, so the systems versus apps, if you wish. That might be incompatibility, and so then in that case you cannot actually share the market with your rivals. So that that last part is in the paper, but I'm not going to discuss that. So what I'm going to discuss actually in this presentation is have a look at tying. So tying behavior is related to this. So that relates back basically to what we did the sixth lecture actually of this course. So that's for the introduction. So what I'm going to look at next is essentially the basic model that we're going to use to study these competitive strategies.